Hi, today we're going to talk about front-end workflows with AngularJS and Grunt. This is a continuation of the screencast series that I've been working through, building a sample app with AngularJS, and in the second version of that screencast, end-to-end with AngularJS, we worked with Laravel as a backend. There was another screencast called Security with AngularJS, and so this is basically a continuation of that. And I like to think that this screencast can stand on its own as sort of an introduction to Grunt and the idea of workflow tools. But there will be some pieces that we're going to examine near the end that have context that you'll be missing if you haven't watched the previous screencasts. So you can either check out the code on GitHub to get that context, or go and check out those screencasts and then come back here. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to look at three key areas. We're going to look at understanding the core tools, just how you can build a basic workflow with Grunt JS. Then once we've done that, we've kind of got a really good foundation for the basics of Grunt. We're going to look at examining an abstraction. There's a tool that my coworker Justin Searles from TestDouble, which is where I work, and myself have created called Lineman.js, and it's basically a higher level tool that utilizes Grunt under the hood, but also adds some nice abstractions for our workflow. So we're going to show you that. And then we'll take a look at a specific example of porting our end-to-end, or the app that we built in end-to-end with AngularJS to this workflow, and that brings forth some interesting discussion points. So as we go along, I've got this extras at the bottom. We'll talk about a couple of different ideas. The idea of treating a web app as a first-class citizen, how can we decouple our client-side code from the server side, and sort of some of the advantages that brings. This idea of productivity and how we can use task automation as a way to boost productivity for not only ourselves but for people on our team. And then examining the browser as a deployment target. This is an interesting idea that I think has sort of really become more viable as the power in the browser grows and as the availability of tools like Grunt has sort of become commonplace. So that's what we're going to work through. Let's start at the beginning with understanding the core tools with basic Grunt JS. If you haven't heard of Grunt, it's the tagline that was recently decided on basically sums it up really accurately. It's a task runner for JavaScript. And it's basically analogous to something like Ant on the server side, or maybe you have a project that you configured using make scripts to automate some of those sort of mundane things that developers do all the time. Copying files to certain directories, deleting things. On the front end, we have optimizations that we do for concatenating files together so that we can work in multiple separate files in dev. And then when we go to prod, we have one sort of concatenated minified file. That's, in essence, kind of what Grunt enables you to do. The interesting thing is that it's got a bunch of default plugins built in, but it also allows you to create custom tasks on your own so that you can kind of create your own workflow. And so I like the way that the web page frames it here. Why would you use a task runner? And I think right off the hop, whoever wrote this was probably Ben Allman, who created Grunt, has it nailed really well. In ordered automation, the less work you have to do when performing repetitive tasks, the easier your job becomes. And in addition to that, I think that developers who don't have these kinds of workflow tools often spend a lot of time chewing up their mind share with cognitive load thinking about these things and working on these small sort of mundane tasks. And when we can automate this, we free up our mind from thinking about all of these things. We free up that cognitive load to enable us to do things like write better applications and things like that. So that's Grunt in a nutshell. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually make a little workflow with Grunt. So I'm just going to make a directory called with Grunt. Let's go in there. And we're going to be working with Node and NPM. I'm assuming you're familiar with those things because they are pieces of the puzzle that you need when you're working with setting up a workflow with Grunt. Now we're just going to set up a vanilla workflow with a very basic set of targets and tasks to give you an idea of how you can do this on your own. The first thing you'll need to do is you'll need Node installed. I have 10.3 at the time of recording of this screencast. You'll need npm installed as well, 1.2.17. I'm a little bit behind, but it should work fine if you're even a few revisions behind or if you've installed and updated to the latest version of Node. So the first thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to install the Grunt CLI globally. I've already got it installed, so I'm not going to run through this, but this is how you would do it: npm install grunt CLI g. And what that does is that gives you the ability to run this grunt command from your terminal. So you can see there when I run grunt, I see the grunt CLI, and I get an error right away, unable to find local grunt. So grunt CLI is basically just the shell command that sort of kicks off running tasks in a workflow with Grunt. But we need a couple more pieces to the puzzle in order to be able to do that. And the first one is we need to have a package JSON file. And the easiest way to get a package JSON file is to do npm init. So we're going to call it with Grunt. We'll just kind of hit enter through these things. A workflow with Grunt. That's fine. We don't have a test. We don't have a Git repo. None of this. I'm going to put my name in as the author and the license, and that's fine. You can see that it gives you a little preview of what it's going to write. We'll say yes. And we don't have a README file. That's okay. And so now, if we go back to Sublime Text, let's open this up. There we go. We can see we got that package JSON file with our name and everything. The reason that this is important isn't for all this metadata, but for the way that Grunt works with dependencies. It uses npm to install its task dependencies and things like that. And so after we've got our package JSON, the next thing that we're going to want to do is install Grunt, the actual sort of core of the framework, locally as a dependency into our workflow. So let's do that here. I'm going to cancel that and just add -save. When you add that flag, it'll actually modify our package JSON. And it should go out to npm on the World Wide Web and grab things. If it's not super slow, there we go. Pulling in all the dependencies. When you add a package, you can see when it's finished, it added it to node modules /grunt, and then it's got a list of all of the top level dependencies that Grunt depends on. So now if we go Grunt, we get a different error message that says a valid Grunt file couldn't be found. And a Grunt file is the place that we are going to configure our workflow with Grunt. So let's add that, gruntfile.js with a capital G. And if we go back to Sublime Text, there's nothing in it, but we're going to basically create this from scratch. And so the way that we do this is we add a function that we're going to add to module.exports. And this is going to be executed when the Grunt CLI runs from the command line. It's going to grab this function from gruntfile.js. It's going to inject the Grunt runtime into here, and then we're able to do some things. And the first way that we are wanting to interact with Grunt to set up our workflow is using this idea of initializing a config. And the config in Grunt is basically the set of task configuration targets that we're going to add for our workflow. The first one that you'll run into, probably wanting to need, is so that Grunt can get a handle to the local package JSON, so that we can, sometimes there's useful metadata that we can use from that to pull in. So let's do that. And now, if we run Grunt, we shouldn't have an error anymore, but there's no default task. So one nice thing about Grunt is as you're working with it, the authors have put a lot of effort into making things kind of user-friendly as you add configuration targets and things like that. If you don't have things quite the right way, you'll get some pretty useful error messages in the console. So let's think and just talk for a little bit about what we want to do with this workflow. Perhaps we've got a member of our team who's maybe not so much a developer, maybe they're just a designer, and they want a workflow using Grunt, and they don't really know what they need, but they know that they want to be able to not worry about having to concatenate files or add a new script element to a web page when they're working on some prototypes or things like that. So we're going to set up a workflow that automates some of those steps, just to alleviate their cognitive load, this designer person on our team, so that they can be more efficient at what they're doing and produce prototypes faster. And so when we think about the way that person would interact with this, the first thing that we might want to do is give them a place to store their files. So let's just add a couple folders. We're going to add a source folder, and we're going to add a vendor folder. And these could be whatever you want. I'm just crafting this workflow for this person, and I'm going to tell them whenever you stick files inside of source, if they're JavaScript, they should go there. If they're CSS, they should go there. And whenever you stick files inside of vendor, vendor being sort of third-party libraries that you're going to add, whether you're using Twitter Bootstrap or any JavaScript files or CSS files. We're going to stick them in those directories. And the workflow that we're going to set up is such that when they are interacting with the terminal or running Grunt, we're going to set up some rules that will basically concatenate all those files together and emit them out into an HTML page, so that their workflow, changes from having to add script and link CSS elements into their HTML, so that they can just basically add files to those directories, and Grunt will sort of automate the process of compiling those things and sticking them together. And the first task that we're going to configure is this idea of concatenation. And there's a couple of things that you do when you're setting up Grunt tasks. There's a number of built-ins that you can check out. So we'll just take a look here at the plugins, and you can see that here's a bunch of the popular plugins, contrib clean. There's a whole bunch of different things, and here's the one that we're going to use, contrib concat. And so the first thing we'll do is we're going to configure it with this target in the config for the task. And we want to concatenate both JavaScript and CSS. So let's do that. And there's a couple of things that we want to tell Grunt. We want to configure it so that it's going to load any of the files in vendor JS first, and then any of the files in source JS. Similarly for CSS, it's going to look pretty much the same, except instead of JS, we're just going to change these to CSS. Let's grab those. There we go. And so now we've configured the task with this, this block, so that when our designer person drops any of those files into here, we're going to look for these things and stick them together in that order. We also need to tell this task where we want that stuff to be output. And so when our designer person is working, we're going to create them basically a directory where all this stuff is going to go. We're going to call it dev. And so that is going to be the destination, which is this desk target, where we stick that stuff. And we want to call the destination is basically the path and the name of the file. And this one should be JS. So just to recap, we've got our concat configuration block. We've got a target of JavaScript and a target of CSS, and each of those have a specific list of files. This ** glob is basically going to make it so that even if we had subdirectories under these two, that we would be able to grab things pretty easily without having to worry about specifying those directories. It's just going to spider recursively into the directory and find the files and put them together in the right order. The order that these things will get put together in is basically dependent on the way that this globbing mechanism works for your operating system. So that's one thing to keep in mind. This differs slightly on OS X on a Mac versus Windows versus Linux, just because of the way the file system is set up. So here's our concat target, but we also need to add those tasks. So we've configured them, we also need to add them. And the way that we do that is using something called load npm tasks. Grunt contrib concat is the name of that task that we looked at there. Yep, it's available from npm. So we're going to tell Grunt, hey, you need to load this thing, and then we also need to install it. So let's do that. Npm install grunt contrib concat, save it. It's going to go out and grab it, and you can see that if we look back in our package.json file, it added Grunt for us. It added grunt contrib concat with the right versions. It's approximately going to install this version and any minor revisions automatically for us with that little tilde. And then now we should be able to run grunt, and we're going to still get the idea that this task default is not found. So here's the pattern that we've gone through. We've configured a task, and we've loaded a task from an npm module, and the last thing that we need to do is we need to set up our workflow, and we do that with grunt.register task. So for right now, let's just stick default in there because it's asking for that default task. It needs to know which one to run. And let's just stick concat in there, which is the name of the task that we want to run. So again, configured the task, loaded that specific task from an npm module. We'll look a little bit later at loading a custom task, and then we've set up our workflow. So now when I run, you can see that I get a message for each of those targets, concat CSS and concat JS, and it created my output for me, so I can take a look in dev. And obviously there's nothing in here yet because we haven't stuck anything in these directories. And so now, we have a basic way that our designer person could, maybe we set them up with this. We maybe create a wrapper around this terminal session with a GUI or something. Maybe we just teach them how to use a terminal because that's a useful skill. And they can run Grunt and they can get that concatenation. Not super useful because they don't have any way to view that inside of a web page yet. So let's add a custom task. So we looked at loading a task from npm. Let's load a custom task. And so in order to do that, we're just going to create a folder in here called tasks. And we'll tell Grunt to load tasks, any tasks that it finds inside of that tasks directory. The task that we're going to add is going to be one to generate this homepage that we want our designers to be able to work with. So let's do that. We're going to start with the config block for that first, so we can get an idea of exactly what we're going to work with. And so our designer, they're going to work with this thing, and we want to add a specific template file that they can add markup to. So we're going to call this index.us for underscore. We're going to make it an underscore template. And you could use whatever templating language you want. There's lots that work with Node and Grunt. We're just going to use this for now. And this will basically, let's just pull in our code from end to end with AngularJS. So we're going to grab that markup that we had, our ng app directive at the top, and all of the stuff that we're going to stick into here. And you'll notice that there's a couple of things that are going to stick out at you. This link element at the top, this is our style sheet element. It's going to go in right before the closing head tag. We're going to inject any of the CSS that comes from our concatenated output here from dev into this template when we compile it and make an HTML file. And any of the JavaScript here from these vendor JavaScript and source JavaScript directories, it's going to go into one bundle here. And we're going to do this so that as our designer is prototyping this app or this, this website, they can just dump files into these directories. Maybe they can use a client-side package manager like Bower or Ender, and they can dump things in here. We're not going to set that up for them right now, but we're just going to basically set up the code so that they can do that. And the scenario here is that they're working on this Angular app that we built in the previous screencasts. So let's flesh out this homepage task a little bit more and show you how to build a custom task. So we want a different target for dev so that we can stick the output in there. And we're going to say that the destination is going to be dev/index.html. And we need to pass a context into this template. And we need to tell it, this is where you can find the JavaScript file, and this is where you can find the CSS file. Oops, app.css, there we go. So that's all the configuration we need, and we are basically creating this from scratch. There's a couple of tasks that you can get that will do this, but I figured it would be a really good exercise to showcase how we can make a custom task. So let's add our homepage task. It's just a JavaScript file. And let's start making this. Again, similar to how we interacted with the Grunt file using module exports. We're going to do the same thing here. Tasks are simple functions that are exported. They inject the Grunt runtime again. We're going to use underscore, which is a pretty useful library because Grunt actually includes a copy of it. And I believe they're using something called Lodash, which is basically an underscore JS compatible API. And again, kind of like we registered our default task here and gave Grunt the list of tasks that it should execute. We're going to register another task with the name homepage, and a description generates a homepage HTML file for our app. It's going to take a function with a target, which is the configuration target from our config file right here. And yeah, we're going to do a bunch of stuff here. We need to get a context for our template that we added. We need to get the source file. We need to get our configuration for that target. And then we need a template that we can write out to a file. So one of the things that you might run into is when you're creating these tasks, you're going to want to be able to pull information from the config that the users are adding, and you might want to also have some sensible defaults. So we're going to grab the target, and we're going to say that it's right now it's dev, but if they haven't provided it, we're going to call it dist for distribution. And another cool thing about Grunt is you can actually add some hints for your users. So if we say that requires config, if they don't actually have this config block, it'll actually throw an error to them. So we're going to say that this task requires the homepage template config as well as the target, whatever they pass in. So in this case, dev or dist if they didn't have it. Let's grab our template. Once we've ensured that they've got that, let's grab the target configuration. Similarly, let's grab the source file. We want to read that template file in, which is our index.us. So we're going to read that in, and then we're going to grab the context for our template. We're going to grab the original configuration from Grunt, which is basically the entirety of this config for the homepage task. And then we're going to extend it using underscores extend with the context from our target config. So that is this one here. And then we're going to write out a file using grunt.file.write. We're going to grab the target config.destination. And then we want the value that we want to write. And the value that we want to write is using underscores template function, passing that context, which is basically going to grab this template, inject our CSS bundle and our JavaScript bundle into this file. And then the last thing that we want to do is just kind of provide some quality of life for the user to let them know that this actually succeeded. So we can say homepage HTML written, target config.dest, and that will actually log things out. So if we did everything well, this seems like a lot to take in, but once we run Grunt, then you'll be able to see how this kind of interacts. So let's run Grunt again. Oh, right, we didn't actually add the task. So we did our step where we configured the task. We've loaded the custom task so it's available. We also need to make it available inside of the context of the register task at the bottom. So let's do that. You can actually provide single tasks to default, or you can provide an array of tasks. And this is sort of how we start crafting our workflow. So let's grab homepage, and let's say dev. We're going to actually specify the specific target right there that we want the homepage task to run. And now, if we run this, you can see there we got homepage dev. So the concatenation happened if we had some files in there, and we got homepage dev written out to dev index.html. Let's just open dev index.html and take a look. We got an undefined error because I haven't actually included any script files in there. We take a look. We can see that all of our markup is there just fine, but none of those files are. We've got a single app.js, which is empty. So let's just add a couple files in there so that you can kind of see how this works. So let's say we added foundation.css, and it makes the background of the body blue. And let's say we added flirter.js, and it's a vendor library, and it just says alerts, I'm a vendor library. And in our app code, let's add app.js and another one to say styles.css, and it makes any h1 elements have a background color of red. And in app.js, we'll make him console.log and the app.js. This is a pretty trivial example, just so we can see that our concatenation task is actually working. So let's run it again. Oops. Grunt. There we go. Let's reload this guy. So there, you can see that our styles got applied, I'm a vendor library was loaded, and console.log, I'm the app.js. So now you can see that the order of inclusion for these things is basically the same as the order that we defined it in the concat task. So we've got Anything in vendor comes first, then anything in source comes next. So you can see that the vendor library came first, and then anything in the source came second. Let's take a look at the CSS. You can see that anything in the vendor stuff came first, which was our foundation with the body background blue, and then our custom app styles with that H1 being the background color red. So this isn't incredibly useful, but basically what we've set our designer up with is a workflow where they can drop files into folders and have a home page that's generated here in index.html, and they can kind of work with that. But this isn't super helpful because we haven't actually automated anything, right? We're still requiring our designer to come in here and execute the grunt task to run that single pass of those things every time something happens. So let's add a little bit more automation to this. There's something called grunt contrib watch, and what watch does is it lets you define targets for monitoring files on the file system to see when they change, and then you can actually use that change event to trigger running a task. And this is how we can kind of automate our tasks. So let's work with watch. Let's set up targets for JavaScript, CSS, and our homepage file, so that if the designer changes the homepage file, then it'll automatically run these things. And watch takes targets, and then it listens for files, and then it runs tasks. So this is the configuration that we can work with. And this showcases another one of the cool features about Grunt, is that you can actually reference internal pieces of other configuration targets. So we've already defined the order that we want our files to be loaded in here for concat. So we can actually reuse that when we're saying, Grunt, these are the files that I want you to watch. So we can grab that named target and use that as a list of files that we want to watch. And then the task that we want to execute in this case is concat JS, which is going to send Grunt a message to run the concat target and the JS target inside of there. So similarly for CSS, we can grab that reference from concat.css, and then we want to run concat CSS as the task. And as well for the homepage, we want to grab homepage.template. So the homepage target, that template file, whenever it changes, we want to recompile and we want to run homepage dev. So again, we've configured that watch task. We need to load it. It's an npm task, so let's do that. We need to install it. Contrib watch. And it's going to pull that in. Let's check our package JSON. Yep, there we go. We got the latest version. So we've configured it, we've loaded it, and now we need to set it up in our workflow. And so the last thing we'll do is add watch to this list. And now what our user gets when they type grunt, the concatenation happened, the generation of the homepage happened, and there's a watcher happening so that when I go here and, for example, change the background color of that H1 from red to orange, I can hit Command S to save. You can see that that watcher noticed that that file on disk changed. It reran the appropriate task. It gave me a timestamp, and then it's continuing to watch and wait. And so now our user can just leave that running in the background, and they can see this. There's another really cool plugin that I'm not going to dive into today called Live Reload that works really well for static websites. Not necessarily appropriate for complex web applications where you've got long-lived state in the browser. Live Reload will detect these changes, and then it has a hook through a Chrome plugin that'll actually reload this so that our designer doesn't have to come back to the page and actually hit Command R to get those changes loaded in the browser. So again, works really well for static websites, not so great for rich client applications where you've got long-lived state in the browser. So this is about all that I wanted to cover in terms of the basics of Grunt. Talking about configuring a task with these targets, loading them from npm if that's where they come from, loading custom tasks, and this directory doesn't have to be called tasks. You can call it whatever you want. We basically set up a place for our designer to store static files and a workflow so that they can just jam files into these directories and not have to worry about adding script elements and CSS elements to our page. We looked at loading a custom task for our home page. And there's a little bit of density in here. I hope that I explained that well enough, but you can always check out the source code after. This homepage task is actually part of a collection of tasks that I'll be covering in a little bit that we use on a regular basis when we're building rich client applications using linemen, which we're going to talk about next. The main point that I wanted to get across is this idea of automating things. It's really easy. You just think about what are the pieces that I need to automate in my workflow, whether I'm automating them for myself or somebody else, and start putting them together. You work with this grunt file, you configure things, you can load external tasks, create your own, and then you just create a workflow, right? This is a really simple workflow: concat, homepage dev, and watch. And yet this simple workflow really eliminates a number of manual steps. It's going to alleviate cognitive load for whoever's going to use this. And that's basically all I wanted to get across when we're talking about Grunt. So you can see that this folder is called with Grunt, and the source code that's going to be available on GitHub will have a folder called that with a few more configuration targets that I didn't have time to get into today, but they should be fairly straightforward to understand. So let's move on to the next thing that we were going to talk about, and that is looking at abstractions and higher level tools. Lineman is a workflow tool that I mentioned Justin Searles, my coworker, and I have written. He actually wrote the majority of the first implementation for a project that we were working on, maybe 8 or 9 months ago, and it turned out to be really useful, and we've kind of just continually added to it since. So let's just take a look at some of the features of Lineman. Let's go here. So here's our with Grunt directory that we just created. We set up that workflow there. Now we're going to do one with Lineman, and we're just going to briefly take a look at some of the features of Lineman. Not all of them, but just enough to give you an idea of how this workflow tool would work in concert with Grunt and would allow you to write rich web applications. Lineman is targeted specifically at rich web applications, whether they're mobile, but basically things that are going to be in the browser, and typically things that are single page apps. So you can set it up to work with multiple page apps, but it was intended to be used with single page apps. To get Lineman, similar to installing Grunt, you can do npm install lineman-g. That will pull you in the latest version, and that gives you a command line tool. So let's grab. So I'm running Lineman 0.7.1. Let's take a look at some of the commands that you can get. So we've got a new command which generates a new Lineman project. It's basically our only generator. You just give it a folder name and it will scaffold you out a directory structure. Run for running a development server. Build for when you're ready to build your assets down to production. It's got a test runner as well. It runs and configures something automatically called testum, which is a really useful runner. We've got a clean target so that we can clean out our dev and our production folders. And then if you want to run any arbitrary task, you can use lineman grunt to do that as well. So that's sort of the command line that you get. Let's take a look at how the scaffolding works. So let's go to code. Let's do lineman new with lineman. And you can see that it finished pretty fast. And the reason for this is you don't install lineman into your local directory. You just install it globally and it sits there. It's got an internal archetype that it uses to generate a directory structure. And then we can go into there. As you can see, it gives you some instructions and this fancy ASCII art. But all that did was basically scaffold us out enough so that we could actually start things up. Let's take a look at what this looks like, what this directory structure looks like. So when we were setting up our vanilla grunt workflow, we had a couple directories. We had that vendor directory. This is very similar. The only dependency that you get out of the box is _JS with lineman in the vendor directory. Here's our tasks directory, so that if you wanted to add custom grunt tasks, you can do that here. The testing setup goes in here. I'm not going to dig too much into that. I've got ideas for another screencast to talk about testing later. And then the other two directories are sort of important. App is basically all of the source code for your app. So CSS, images, and JavaScript, and then any template files. And you can use underscore templates, handlebars templates out of the box as sort of the default template implementations. The other folder that I want to just highlight on this sort of tour of the scaffold that you get is this config folder. So previously with Grunt, we had everything sort of stuck in this Grunt file, all of the targets, and everything was in here. What we found is that with lineman, it made sense to split some of those concerns into separate files. So all of this stuff interacts with the Grunt configuration, but we split it over a couple of files, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that lineman actually includes a set of default tasks that you can extend from. So let's just take a look at lineman's default tasks. This is a CoffeeScript file. You can use CoffeeScript or JavaScript. Lineman's configured to work with both. So we've set a bunch of tasks that are common to our workflow here that we basically have as a baseline for all of the rich web applications we've worked on in the last 18 months. These are sort of the minimum set of tasks in our workflow that we need. So the ability to compile CoffeeScript, less, which is a style sheet preprocessor framework, JS hint for JavaScript files, super useful for making sure you don't leave a trailing comma in IE, handlebars, the ability to just compile arbitrary templates into this JST namespace, concat, which I've already showed you, a little task to copy images from dev to production. It doesn't do any image optimization or anything like that. It's basically just a copier. Same with web fonts. And then there's our homepage tasks. So these should be pretty familiar. Then we've got some dev lifecycle tasks that we've classified. So the ability to run a dev server, and then that watch, which you run in dev, and then a whole bunch of things related to production. When you're ready to build, you can run lineman build. And it basically will run this set of Grunt tasks. Uglify to minify things on the JavaScript side, CSS min to minify CSS, copying images to their respective folders, same with web fonts, and then running the homepage task in its distribution. So this is all I want to show you about sort of the built-in set of default tasks. Basically, when you run lineman new and you scaffold out a directory, you're going to get this set of default tasks. But you can totally change and interact with that, and that's what we're going to take a look at here. So this application JS file is where you would add any additional task configurations that you would want to use. And there's a couple of commented out notes here. We're going to dive into that a little bit later. And similarly with files, anything that you would want to override here would control load order. So kind of like we had in our vanilla Grunt with the concat task loading things, we've got some sensible defaults that you can extend from here. So that's basically the tour of what lineman gives you in terms of scaffold. So very lightweight, some default tasks, and some default targets that you can work to extend. So let's take a look at how I extended that stuff when I was building the next part, which is the with lineman. So I scaffolded it out, and I did a number of different things. The first one that I did was I took all of our code from end-to-end with AngularJS that was in that app.js file. And if you remember the previous screencast, I was having a problem navigating this file. I was manually grepping for the authentication service, I think. And it just got really tedious because I was looking through the file to find out where the definition for that thing was. And it's kind of hard to figure out where it is. Oh, there it is. It's app.factory. This started to sort of highlight one of the pain points. Working in a single file, right? It doesn't scale very well. I've got all these different competing concerns and responsibilities in here. And so one of the first things I did was I took all of that code and I split it out into separate files. So you can see here, this is my lineman directory scaffold, that app folder that I showed you. Here's all of the code that I took from end-to-end with Angular from this one file that was 180 lines long, and I jammed it into here. Let's just take a look at what I did. And there's no preset convention that lineman imposes on you. This is just how I decided to slice things. So here's my app file with the top level module and that ng sanitize that we injected in security with AngularJS. And that's all that's in this file. Here's my router, which basically only has the responsibilities of configuring the route provider in Angular. I've got a couple of buckets for the config and run blocks that we had. So if you remember in security, we dealt with the idea of protected routes, very sort of trivial algorithm for that. So that's this run block is inside of here, protect routes, and log user out when the session expires. We had this response interceptor that we used. We stuck that in here. So just a really nice way to sort of stick everything into nice little buckets. So I've got my controllers all in here, my directive in here. And so it was really nice to be able to split up that large file into small pieces, isolated units. And so now, if I'm working in my app and I want to look for authentication service, there, I can, I know the name of the file, I can just grab it. And then I have the context of whatever is just inside of this file. So how did I configure load order? Because if I'm splitting all these things up, right, it probably imposes some sort of a load order. So let's take a look at that. That's where I highlighted lineman's config directory. So let's take a look at files. And you can see again here, the JavaScript target basically defines the files for JavaScript. And you can see that vendor is the first one and app is the second one. And my only load order dependency here is Angular needs to come first, and anything else in vendor needs to come after it. Angular sanitize needs Angular to be there first. And then all my app code, and again, app is the only thing that needs to come first because I'm defining my module. And anything after that, at least with respect to an Angular application, is going to be injected into that app module. And this sort of speaks to one of the really nice design decisions in Angular, which is the bootstrap phase. When we look at our template and we add that ng app directive, it's guaranteed not to occur until the DOM ready event has fired. So until all of the static assets have finished loading in the browser and the browser triggers that DOM ready event, that's when Angular will kick things off. If we go back to our end-to-end with Angular JS code, the next improvement that I made was thinking about this idea of promoting our rich client app, our Angular app, to a first-class citizen. So what does that mean? I'll try and explain here. Basically, it means that as it stood in end-to-end with Angular JS, we were tightly coupled to Laravel as our backend. And there wasn't a ton of things that were tightly coupling us to that, but there were a few significant ones. The first was asset management, right? We basically had link elements and script elements in the head of our file that was being served up from the single page view. So the load order was defined here, hard-coded, Angular sanitize underscore, and then everything in that app.js file. And so once we moved it to this directory structure where we've got things split out into separate responsibilities, we're defining the load order with these very simple directives and targets in our Grunt config. That really improved our ability to not have to worry about load order, especially in conjunction with Angular's design decision to delay bootstrapping until all of the static assets have been loaded on the page. So not having to think about load order is pretty nice, at least any further than this. The other thing that, and so that's, moving this configuration to Grunt inside of our lineman app has alleviated us from having to deal with asset management inside of our Laravel app context. And the other piece that we needed was the idea of this constant, right? The CSRF token was basically the only piece of information that we needed prior to our app kicking off, so that any requests that we made to the backend could inject that token. And so this was tightly coupled because the page that we were rendering was a PHP page. So let's take a look at what we did to extract that piece and talk about the idea of manually bootstrapping. So I added this file called bootstrap.js, and what we did was we added a route to Laravel. Take a look at Laravel app routes. These are the same routes from end-to-end with AngularJS. We added a route for the CSRF token. Basically, this exposes that dependency so that we are not required to inject it inside of a page like this. We can actually query an API for it. And so what I'm going to show in a little bit is our lineman app, so basically our self-contained client-side app running separately from our server side, but being able to still operate and talk to the server side because we exposed this CSRF token as an API endpoint. So let's just briefly take a look at how that works. And this will showcase how you can basically manually bootstrap. And when I say manually bootstrap, what I mean is, let's take a look at the homepage template. You'll notice that now in my lineman context that there is no ng app directive. That's the directive that you use if you want Angular to automatically bootstrap the app for you. We're not going to do that. We want to manually bootstrap because before we kick off the app, we actually need to get that CSRF token injected as a constant, and then we can call bootstrap. So what we're doing is grabbing a handle to the document element, listening for that DOM ready event with Angular, grabbing a handle to our app module, going out and fetching that token using $.ajax, which isn't jQuery's Ajax. It's actually a small, tiny library called request, which is, I think, like 500 lines. It's just a simple Ajax transport. And the reason I did that was because I couldn't find a way to get a handle to HTTP outside of the context of an Angular app. So I added this tiny little library called request, which has a jQuery compatible API, really good browser support. And I used that to fetch the token. Once we have that token, we can set it as a constant. Then we can actually call bootstrap. So let's look at what this looks like. So we're going to with lineman, we'll say lineman run. You can see that similar to our vanilla Grunt workflow, there's a whole bunch of tasks that were run. There's some other tasks that I'll get into specifics on what we were configuring for Angular, but you can see that there's a whole bunch of things that just ran. One of the last ones was we ran a server task. So lineman includes a built-in dev server. So now if we go to localhost 8000, and you can see that it's trying to fetch that CSRF token, but nothing's happening. Let's open up that server file. And one of the things that you can interact with, and one of the things that's really useful as a front-end developer, is being able to stub out API endpoints before you even have a backend. So right now I don't have my Laravel app running, which is why I'm getting that 500. It's trying to load this CSRF token just from my static web server that's basically serving up the files inside of this generated directory. So generated is kind of like that dev directory that we created. It's basically all of the compiled assets for dev, and that's where lineman serves its assets out of. Let's run that again for our workflow. And let's uncomment these calls. And what this does is this allows us to stub out endpoints. And this is super useful. I mentioned that one of the workflow items that front-end developers often have on their plates is they want a really easy way to stub out Ajax so that they don't have to fake it. And this allows us to actually use Express.js under the hood, which is a very lightweight web server, and define routes in a way similar to Sinatra, if you've ever used that. And so we can stub out all of our endpoints. I'm stubbing out that CSRF token endpoint. And so now, if we kick off our dev server, you can see that things are good. And the token that it loaded was that one that I stubbed out. So what lineman allows you to do is stub out these endpoints before your backend is finished. Now, obviously, we've got our Laravel backend completed, but it's still pretty powerful to be able to run a front-end app completely isolated from the server side and still go through and actually work on these things. And you can see that there's all the other requests that it's making. So my auth request, it's actually making to this stub, and we can verify that just by looking at the response that was returned. /yay for auth login, we can log out, take a look at what was returned there, logged out. So pretty cool, the ability to stub out the server side so that we can sort of design our API before we even build it on the back end. But because we are extracting our end-to-end with Angular code base from Laravel, making our app a basically first-class citizen with all of the tooling and workflow stuff that we have, we actually want to be able to hit that Laravel app so that we can test against it. So let's comment these out. Let's take a look in the config in application. And one of the other features that lineman includes is the ability to proxy any API requests to a server running on a different port. And so if you remember from the previous video in end-to-end with Angular JS, let's just go into there. One of the ways that we ran that server was using PHP artisan serve, which started on 8000. You can actually pick which port you want to run it on by doing this on 3000. And so now if I go to localhost 3000, there I've got my app running. And then there, this is, you'll notice those requests are happening for the templates again. That's another thing I'm going to cover in just a second that's different when we extract it out to lineman. But we don't want to do that. We want to actually be able to use the stripped down version of our app that we ran or that we created for this. So I've basically taken end-to-end with AngularJS. I've stripped all the client things out, stuck them into lineman. The server-side things are still here. The only addition being we've got this route for exposing the CSRF token. So let's just jump back to this API proxy. So when we run, the workflow that I like to work with is I have my alignment app, and it's got all my client-side code. I can stub out my endpoints if I want to in server, but the more useful thing is to be able to actually hit that API endpoint and simulate what my app is going to be like when I deploy it in production. In which case, I would be basically just deploying the static HTML, JS, and CSS files inside of that Laravel app, or however I'd serve it. Maybe I'd serve up those static assets with a different front end like Nginx or something like that. And as I was creating the screencast, one of the interesting pieces I ran across was even if I did this and ran PHP artisan serve, this is actually running PHP's 5.4 built-in web server under the hood. There's actually a bug in that where headers, for example, the cookie header that Laravel sets, if you send it a lowercase cookie header, Laravel will give you a new session on every request because the built-in PHP web server can't handle that. If it's an uppercase cookie header, it deals with that no problem. And Lineman's API proxy is actually using a Node module called Node HTTP proxy. And it sends headers in lowercase, which is totally valid because according to the HTTP spec, you should be able to send headers in lowercase or uppercase, and the server shouldn't care. So this is a bug in PHP, but I wasn't about to be deterred from showing how my workflow works. And so what I did was I actually set up Nginx. You can do this with Apache as well, to run my Laravel app. So now I started up Nginx, and my Nginx configuration is running on port 3000. So that's why I'm proxying here, and that's running the Laravel app. So now I've got my Nginx running with the Laravel app. I've got Lineman running on 8000, and it's going to proxy any requests that don't match up for assets in Lineman's static assets directory. So any of these JavaScript files, CSS files, images files, template files, it's going to forward those onto Laravel. And so now we're on 8000, which is our Lineman app. If we reload, you can see that I got a CSRF token. It's no longer the stubbed one. This is the actual one coming from Laravel. I can verify that by actually going to 3000, grabbing it. So there's Laravel. I can reload. I'm not getting a new session set on every time. And I've effectively separated my server side into an API and my client side into simulating what it's going to be like when I serve up this HTML page and these JavaScript and CSS files from within Laravel. But I'm able to decouple them and not be tied to any specific backend. And this is really cool because now I've got this target or this artifact in my app that I can actually take and deploy on multiple different backends. Or maybe I didn't even want to have a backend. Maybe I wanted to just simulate this with HTML5 session storage. You know, I wanted to add a Rails backend and do this. As long as my Rails backend conforms to the API that I've set here in the routes file and implements that CSRF token route and endpoint, then my client-side assets could be deployed into any front-end or any server-side backend. And so when we're ready to do that, we would run line and build, which would run all of our build time dependencies. It would compile everything, concatenate everything, minify with uglify. And if we take a look at what that produces in the dist folder, you can see that we got our minified CSS file, we got our images, our minified JavaScript file, and our indexed HTML. So the only thing we would have to do to deploy is basically copy these into Laravel's public folder, or basically the public folder for whatever server-side framework you're using. So that would be our only deploy step. And we're working on a simple way to automate that with the idea of Lineman deploy into, and for example, Laravel. And then there would be some configuration that you would set up as a grunt task so that it would know, okay, I need to run the build to generate my static assets for production, and then I need to copy all those into a specific directory. So let's go back here, and highlight a couple other pieces of the puzzle. So I talked about manually bootstrapping in Bootstrap JS. You can remove the directive, the ng app directive, from your homepage. You can do any kind of transport that you need to get data from the server or from your API prior to bootstrapping. Set some values and then call angular.bootstrap. So we can do manual bootstrapping. Some of the other quality of life improvements that we wanted to make were we didn't want to have to fully qualify all of our dependencies. If you remember in the previous screencast, one of the ways that you could do that is with this array of arguments. But that seems really rather cumbersome. And yet when we go to minify, if we don't have that in here, then things would just break. So what we did was added a couple more targets. We added grunt ngmin to solve that minification. Grunt ngmin, if you check it out, by Bryant Ford, who actually just joined the Angular team, I believe, last week. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, it basically allows you to provide a grunt config. Let's take a look. So we want to grab any of the files that we're concatenating, and we want to stick them out. So it's basically a simple input, simple output. And if we take a look at those in, let's open up that dist directory, take a look at the minified code. And you can see that if I look for HTTP provider, here's my app module. And ngmin actually went and statically added that so that I didn't have to do that in my app code. So that's very cool. And that's as easy as adding grunt ngmin. You can see here, again, I've added it to my package JSON. I've configured it in this grunt task here, loaded npm tasks. This array is Lineman's way of getting around having to call grunt.load npm tasks every time. And we've configured it here. So whatever gets concatenated in that one bundle, I want you to output it to dest with your static analysis. So that happens once. Similarly, if you noticed, there's no requests for templates because all of the templates are basically precompiled. Let's take a look at what that looks like. That's set up using Grunt Angular templates. So again, we've automated precompiling our templates so that we don't have to load them over XHR. So I've added the task. It's an npm task, and then I've configured it with this configuration target. We want to grab templates from here, app templates, and they want to go into generated Angular and the template cache, at least for development mode. And we want to grab any of the templates here. So you can see that inside of this templates directory, I've got my home page, and then I've got all of those templates that we had from the previous app. So that's pretty much all you need to do. You need to add ng templates and ngmin, and those quality of life tasks automate a lot of really nice things for us. Let's open up the template cache and just take a look at what that looks like. So here's generated, let's see Angular, there's my template cache. So again, it knows about the context of our app module. It's injecting the template cache, and it's just going to put values for a particular key, so Angular/books, Angular/home, which map to those right there, Angular/books, Angular/home, and it's just precompiled the templates and stuck them into the JavaScript so that we don't have to have those XHRs. So that's my workflow with Lineman. It allows me to really easily decouple my front-end code so that I can work on things separately from the server. When I'm ready to, I can hook up this API proxy so that I can actually run my server side and my client side and sort of see how they connect it together. And it just gives me the power to treat my front-end development as a first-class citizen. If you're interested in Lineman, you can check out linemanjs.com. If you've heard of another popular tool like in this similar vein, Yeoman, Lineman's kind of like Yeoman's little brother. It doesn't do as much as Yeoman, and it definitely doesn't have as many generators. It's been kind of handcrafted for our workflow, but we've had pretty good feedback from people that have been using it to build client-side heavy applications. We've also got a bunch of templates. We've got one for Backbone, Angular, and Ember. So if you check out, on my GitHub repo, I have one called Lineman Angular template that basically gives you what I just showed you, the pre-configured template pre-compilation, ngmin, and a lot of the stuff that we built in this app sort of as a starting point so that you can use to continue to build against. And it's got support for that API server built in and all those kinds of things. So let's just talk a little bit about why it's important to have this kind of a separation. We looked at building things with vanilla Grunt, showed you how you could craft a workflow, how to configure tasks, install NPM tasks, how to make custom tasks, and why it's important to be able to make your own workflow to relieve the cognitive load that we often have as developers working on these mundane tasks. So that's in the with Grunt folder that you can check out on GitHub. Then I showed sort of what was necessary to extract our tightly coupled end-to-end with AngularJS app from within Laravel and pull all of those static assets out and use something like Lineman to be able to, not have everything in one big file, control load order, have some really nice quality of life improvements like the ability to pre-compile templates using Grunt Angular templates, using ngmin so that I didn't have to fully qualify dependencies in my Angular code, and just the idea of treating this app as a first-class citizen, decoupled from that server-side framework so that I'd have the flexibility to take this app and plug it into Rails or plug it into Python Django, or maybe not even use a backend at all. I've just got this nice little self-contained artifact. It can be in a separate code base. And so that's in the with Lineman folder. And then the modifications that I actually made to Laravel weren't that many. Again, just added this CSRF token route to expose that. I showed you how we can bootstrap manually. And that's basically what I wanted to show. This isn't exhaustive. There's probably other things that you're going to want to add to customize your workflow, but I think it's important to understand the fundamentals, to understand Grunt at a lower level, to take a look at abstraction, and to just take a look at an example of how somebody else works with their front-end code and a workflow that works for them. If you have any questions, please feel free to hit me up on Twitter or contact me on GitHub. You can file an issue against Lineman. It's in the testable organization. I'm going to include links to all this stuff in the video description. Please check it out. And I hope that at a minimum, this has given you an idea of what it takes to be able to build a workflow for yourself and enough interest that you would be able to use something just like even if you just use vanilla Grunt to craft yourself a workflow. That's a net win in my opinion, because I think more developers need to figure out how to be able to have the power to craft their own workflows. Thanks for watching, and again, please hit me up on Twitter with any questions. Bye.